Boker Tov. This week we are beginning the book of Devarim, the final book of the Torah. And as I've spoken about in the past couple of weeks, it's a very unique book because, well, the presence and voice of God is certainly present throughout this book. In many ways, this is Moshe's last hurrah. The book literally begins with these are the words that Moshe spoke to the people. Now, what he's sharing with them are things, a great deal of things that he's heard and learned from God, but a lot of it is also his personal 2 cents. And in fact, he gets quite personal. And that's what we're actually going to focus on today when he makes some, I don't want to say admissions, but in many ways, he is admitting some of his limitations as a leader and how it's been challenging for him and how he responded to it and how the people then responded to his admission that I don't know if I can do this on my own. However, there's a particularly interesting coincidence because the word that he uses to describe his limitations as a leader happened to show up in the book of Eicha. In fact, that is the word Eicha, how. And there was a question of, is there any connection there? Do the rabbis pick up on the connection? Of course they do. But we're going to see, what is the significance of Moshe using language that's only, I think it's like, this word is only about 18 times in the whole Torah. So it's a relatively rare word. So what's the significance of him using this word now? So what we'll do is first we'll read a few verses from the book of Devarim, and then I'll focus back on the word which I bolded in the Hebrew, and then we'll look at how the rabbis respond to this and try and understand what might be the connection between the book of Eicha, which I'll discuss more when we get there, and how Moshe starts his final speech. So the context here at the book of Devarim is Moshe, it's sort of reviewing what just happened. We just had a big battle. And then he starts talking about all of the amazing things that God has done. God promised that he would multiply you, et cetera, like that. And that's where he jumps in saying, God made so many of you like he promised, but there's a lot more of you than I thought I would have to deal with, children. So Gloria, if you would please take source number 1, please.
Thereupon I said to you, I cannot bear the burden of you by myself. Your God has multiplied you until you are today as numerous as the stars in the sky. May the God of your ancestors increase your numbers 1,000-fold and bless you as promised. How can I bear unaided the trouble of you and the burden and the bickering? Pick from each of your tribes candidates who are wise, discerning, and experienced, and I will appoint them as your heads. You answered me and said, what you propose to do is good.
Excellent. So if you look in the column on the right, I bolded that word in Hebrew, echa, which is similar to the modern Hebrew word eich. It's basically the same word, but it's how. So echa esa levadi. How can it's like carry alone. And the carrying is referring to what happens after the word levadi. Tarchachem, umasechem, verivchem. And there's actually several different possible translations, but terach is like, the troubles. Amasechem are like the burdens that you carry, and rivchem are the fighting. And again, we'll look at a source below that kind of digs at least into the last one, but the rabbis basically take each of those words and say they refer to a different kind of challenge or issue that they brought. Some of them were petty things. Some of them were things that were inappropriate fights. Some of them were financial. It just covers like every one of the issues that they brought to Moshe. And as we know from earlier in the Torah, people came to him for everything. He looked at me funny. He stuck my tongue out at me. I'm not referring to anything that happened in the car today in my real life, but things like that. And Moshe said, it's enough already. If there were 5 of you, I could deal with this, but there are thousands upon thousands of you. I can't deal with it. So his brilliant father-in-law Yitro said, well, why don't you get people to help? And God said, I love that idea. You should appoint people to help you. And Moshe did. And in fact, what he says here is that when he went to the people and said, instead of me answering all of your questions, I'll focus on the big ones. And again, this is also a little bit about leadership and appointing people to delegating to other people. And he says, I'm going to put other people in charge of your small matters, petty matters. And according to him, the people responded, that's a great idea. We're fine not going to you for everything, but we need someone to go to. We'll come back to that idea. So that's the shot, the simple contextual understanding of what's going on here. But again, we want to understand what's going on in Moshe's head when he says that, Echa esa levadi, how can I do this? like he's admitting his limitations. He's frustrated, perhaps that there is all this nonsense going on. He said, if you only came to me with real matters, with real issues, it'd be like once a month, it'd be fine. So maybe he's frustrated at that. Or maybe he says, I want to be able to answer even your tiny things, but I physically cannot do it. So regardless of it, he's frustrated. And we see this come out in a number of ways, yelling at the people. And that may be the reason why he's not even allowed into the land of Israel, because he expects that he alone can solve everything. And whenever a leader says that, they can never do it. And his recognition is, you know what? I can't do it alone. I need help. And that's a beautiful, beautiful recognition as a leader. However, his personal inclination might be, I can do everything. That might be his default. And that's not the kind of leader that people need going into the land of Israel. They need someone who can delegate, someone who recognizes that you need to work together. So that's the power of Moshe's moment, what's going on here. But as I said, that word Eicha doesn't show up a lot in the Torah, but it does show up in Gloria. I'll just have you take source number 2. It shows up at the beginning of the book of Lamentations. Now, this book does not identify its author. It is identified with the prophet Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah. Why? First of all, he was present at the destruction of the temple, went into exile with the people. So historically, much of the book he would have been aware of. However, there's some challenges to that. There's certain events that it doesn't make sense that he could have seen, perspectives that don't make sense. But there are a lot of clues and hints in the book that it could be Yirmiyahu. But regardless, the author of Eicha is someone who saw or had intimate knowledge, even if it was a little bit later, had intimate knowledge of the suffering of the people going into exile. And the book accomplishes many things. I'll speak more about it on Saturday night when we actually read Eicha. But in some ways, it's them just literally ripping out their hair and screaming, God, why did you do this? To going through this emotional journey of, God, I know why you did this, but it's still incredibly painful. And one of the questions is, did the author of Eicha ever come to, God, I forgive you? Or is that tension left throughout the book between, God, I know why you did it, but I'm still angry? So Eicha is an incredibly powerful work. And there's a lot of frustration in the book of Eicha, both from the people and from God, that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. So Gloria, go ahead, source number 2. It's just the first verse of Eicha.
How does the city sit solitary that was full of people? How has she become like a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces, how has she become a vassal?
So here it's one of the things they're doing is comparing how amazing was the city before and how it has fallen. But it's also perhaps this um, recognition that the city was so great. So not, oh, it was so great and now it's fallen, but because it was so great, it shouldn't have fallen. It was awesome. Why couldn't they still be around? So again, that Eicha seems to come up when there's something, deeply frustrated and disappointment. There's a different pronunciation of the word Eicha, how, early on in the Torah, when God is asking someone a question that God is deeply disappointed in because they killed somebody. Does anyone know? It's a different pronunciation, but the exact same letters, and it means something slightly different, but it's the same letters, where God is asking someone a question. Ayeka, where are you? When God is talking to Cain, when God is talking to Cain. So it's a different meaning, and historically, etymologically, there may be more differences there, but the rabbis do pick up on that and
Does
say,
it have a hey? Does
I,
it have ayecha?
I believe so, but we could double check that. But the rabbis do connect it and consider it to be connected to Eicha, and that it's again, it's that moment of great disappointment, and maybe that's something that Moshe has here. So Jane, in source number 3, early on, the rabbis in the Midrash made this explicit connection between the Eicha of Moshe and the Eicha of Eicha. And in fact, and I talked about how the rabbis, the book of Lamentations doesn't identify their author, but Jeremiah, the potential author, perhaps the likely author actually, also uses the word Eicha. So go ahead, Jane, Eicha Rabbah 1:1.
How does the greatly crowded city sit alone? She has become like a widow, great among the nations, a princess among the states. She has become a vassal. How Eicha does sit alone. 3 prophesied with the term Eicha: Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. Moses said, how Eicha can I bear alone? in Deuteronomy 1:12, which we just read. Isaiah said, how Echa did the faithful city become a harlot? Isaiah 1:21. Jeremiah said, how Echa does the greatly crowded city sit alone? Rabbi Levi said, this is analogous to a noblewoman who had three friends. One saw her in her tranquility, one saw her in her debauchery, and one saw her in her disgrace. So Moses saw them in their glory and their tranquility and said, how can I bear alone your troubles? Isaiah saw them in their debauchery and said, how did the faithful city become a harlot? Jeremiah saw them in their disgrace and said, how does the greatly crowded city sit alone?
Excellent, thank you. So connects this historically. So certainly what Jeremiah Yirmiyahu saw and what's discussed in the book of Eicha, Jeremiah's book, he's warning the people about what's going to happen. So how can you let this happen? In Eicha, how did you let this happen? How could this have happened? So those make sense, but putting Moshe in there is an interesting choice. And the question I started with, or one of the first questions is there more than just a linguistic connection here? Is it just coincidence that Moshe uses the word Echa? And this Midrash says no. Moshe sees something in this moment. He sees how the people are constantly fighting with each other. And again, that'll come up more in the next source. It's not just that the people have legitimate challenges. Oh, we've discovered some new great issue that face the people. We try to resolve it on our own legitimately, and we're just unsure what to do. Then we go to the leader. The implication here is that in the issues that the people are bringing to Moshe, they are a foreshadowing the kind of infighting and issues that they're going to have later as a nation. They're going to be so constantly bickering that, and in the times of the Second Temple, it ultimately led to civil war. It's slightly different in the First Temple, but not really. A lot of the issues that led to the destruction of the temple weren't idolatry or the other, certainly not the nations that defeated them, is that the people were not united. The northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they were split kingdoms, and this goes back very far, and it's all born out of things that some of them are legitimate issues, but mostly the issues that divided the people were often petty, or at least in retrospect they were. So Moshe can see that all of these little issues, yes, he's frustrated because he can't deal with all of them, but he's frustrated that the people are just bringing up so much nonsense, and he can see this is going to become a bigger issue. If you guys keep fighting, kind of, again, like children, siblings that fight when they're young, oftentimes they'll figure it out when they're older, but sometimes it's a harbinger of things to come. And if they don't figure it out when they're young, which Moshe hopes they will, then they'll end up fighting as adults, and it might tear the family apart. Now, that, of course, is one extreme, but that's Moshe's point. If they don't figure out how to work together and stop this pointless bickering, it will destroy them. And guess what? This Midrash says that's exactly what happens. Moshe saw it coming, warned them early. Jeremiah said it's already happening, but maybe we can stop it. And Eicha says it's happened. How did this happen? Let's look back at all the things that led to it. And again, we can point our fingers at everyone. And the book of Eicha does have, I think, at least one chapter where the finger is basically pointed at God, but then quickly the author of Eicha takes that finger and points it back at ourselves and said, oh, wait a minute. God did the destruction for which we're shocked. How could God do this? But the answer is, of course, God did it because God warned us and we brought it on ourselves. So that is one possible connection, or the likely connection between those three Eichas. But one of the things I've been emphasizing is this, how Moshe saw this pointless bickering. And that's something that the rabbis do pick up on very, very strongly. And Gloria, I'll have you take this source, then I'll take the last one. So Ovadia Sforno writes about, he actually, before this, he writes two commentaries translating each of the complaints, the terach and troubling, everything like that. And again, he really points out that they're just pointless bickering. And then this last one, rivchem, which in modern Hebrew, riv is just like a conflict, fighting between two people. He translates as, money ones, like financial one. But again, he still kind of classes it here as fights that really didn't need to come to the greatest profit we've ever had. So go ahead, Gloria, please.
And your mutual financial claims upon one another. He reminded them of all this in order that they should remember their sins. He hoped that the people repented their past conduct honestly, for in the past, in spite of Moses having told them that they would take over the land of Canaan, even without of, of Canaan without even having to fight for it, something that should have been their major concern, seeing that they were in the desert. Rather than focusing on their major problem, how to get out of the desert into the promised land, they had wasted their time and efforts in the pursuit of petty concerns, undermining their interpersonal relationships in the process. Due to this interminable quarreling, Moses had been forced to appoint a large number of judges that had to exert authority over the individuals, down to every 10 people requiring at least one such judge. This could only have been due to some character weakness, some predisposition to be quarrelsome.
Excellent. Thanks. So Sforno picks up on this perfectly. Is he says basically you should have been focusing only on the big problems, dealing with the issue at Hangain in the desert. Instead, they were dealing with their petty concerns. I mean, he's quite explicit here. And then he says this is the way Moshe has to deal with it. He sets up all these, sub judges to deal with the petty concerns. But again, he starts with the only reason they needed that is because there's a fundamental flaw that they are not dealing with. So it's not the fact that the fighting is petty, it's that there's a bigger issue going on here. And then the point is they never really deal with it. And it comes out again throughout history. And I've spoken of it before is, the first time we were exiled, it was only 7 years. Perhaps that's because God was thinking, if I wipe out all of the leaders, all these corrupt kings, the people will figure it out. And then he brings us back with two incredible leaders, Ezra and Nehemiah, but it's clear that the people still haven't figured out how to work together. And the civil wars in the times of the Romans and the Maccabees, again, in amongst the Jews, are almost in some ways worse than they were in earlier history. And we're now in the thousands of years of figuring out how Jews can work together. There's an incredible rabbi in Israel who's, writing books to make Jewish law accessible to the people. And of course, what happens, because he's making it accessible, he's getting attacked left and right by rabbis saying, how dare you ever write a book that is accessible to the people he's writing about in marriages. And they say, how dare you, you're not supposed to write that kind of stuff. Whether they expect that people just don't know about healthy sexual relationships or what, but like it's not disgusting what he's writing, it's disgusting that he's being attacked for trying to make traditional Judaism, classical law, accessible to the people. And the people who are attacking him are generally these ultra-Orthodox rabbis that are in these cloistered, cut off from Judaism. Now they are appropriate for their communities, but they're not speaking to the rest of the Jewish world. So everywhere you look, amongst the Orthodox, the conservative, the Reform, it doesn't matter what denomination or how people identify, we still have not figured out how to work together. And I've often said, there's this old midrashic teaching that if the whole Jewish world kept either 2 or 3 Shabbatot like fully in a row, Mashiach would come. And that sounds, that's mythological and spiritual and supernatural. But the reality is, if every Jew in the world were so united that we could all decide to keep full Shabbat, the work that would lead up to that, the internal work, the psychological work of the unity of the Jewish people, I'd say the Mashiach is already here. The Messiah is already here. The Jewish people actually work together on that scale. We would probably have everything that's being promised in the times of the Mashiach. We would have some sort of peace in Israel. Not that it's impossible, but it's a lot more work than just praying, doing a couple mitzvot, and some supernatural event. The Jewish people have a lot of work to do before we bring the good times. And Moshe knew that, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu knew that, and the book of Eicha saw, the other side of it, what happens when the people are so torn apart. But there's actually one more beautiful connection. There's an article here, and I think it's from, just scrolling down, it's from, I thought I put in, I think it's from, here, Jewish Boston, the Boston Jewish newspaper. And it connects not only our parasha, not only the book of Eicha, but this Shabbat is known as Shabbat Chazon, Chazon being like a vision of the future. And there's a special Haftorah that is read. And this is going to connect all 3 of those in, I think, a very beautiful way. And it starts with it doesn't start with, in the middle of the article, it goes right to our question about the word Eicha. So the point of the word Eicha, how? How can Moshe be expected to bear the weight of the people on his shoulders? The word Eicha also opens the book of Lamentations, read on the fast of Tisha B'Av, which begins on Saturday night, this Saturday night. Eicha, lonely sits the city, once great with people. We read this verse earlier. She that was among great nations has become like the widow. The princess among states has become a thrall. Eicha, what does it mean? Alas, says the new JPS translation. How, says the 1917 JPS version. Others suggest in that way, what, or with some vowel switching, the word becomes ayeka, where are you? And that's, as I pointed out, it is the same letters, it's just a matter of vowels. But again, the word eicha can have more than one implication. It can just be a simple question like, how did this happen? But there's so much more behind it, and that might be intentional, certainly from the rabbi's perspective. It's the perfect word for both cases. In Moses's case, how did I allow the people to continue to be so rebellious and difficult? Alas, I can't handle them. In what way could I have acted differently? It's using, all the different ones to express Moshe's feelings. What did I do to create this situation? Where was I when this all happened? Where am I as a leader? So one word can imply all of this. And by the way, even though this is midrashic, there's not this many words in that one sentence in the Torah. When we read that sentence in the Torah, I think it's not crazy to read into it all of these possible things, that Moshe is both frustrated with the people and frustrated with himself. And in the case of Lamentations and of Jeremiah, how did this all come to pass? Alas, the city lies in ruins. In what way did we act to cause this calamity to befall us? What did we do to deserve this? What can we do to begin the healing process? Where were you, God, when this happened? Where are you, God, to deliver us and redeem us? And going back again to that midrash that we read, it talked about Moshe's perspective, Jeremiah's, and then the book of Eicha's perspective, and likened it to a woman at 3 stages in her downfall. And here it kind of also talks about that. There were all of these different stages of the process of falling, both personal responsibility of the other. Things don't just happen like that. It's a slow fall. How did we let this happen? Where were we? What could we have done to prevent it? Those are all questions we ask when a trauma or a tragedy strikes. The Haftorah this week for Shabbat Chazon is the third Haftorah of admonition, which again, the prophets all saw that, just like Moshe saw it, the prophets saw this coming. Why didn't the people listen? Because they're people. And if you want to say, oh, maybe the prophets weren't as popular, or they wrote it a little bit later and they were, we would have said this. No, it's 2022. And there are scientists who are telling us, or politicians, about the things that are going to happen if we don't start working on climate change, on democracy, etc. Are people listening to those legitimate concerns? No. Are those issues continuing, getting worse? Yes. So let's not blame Jeremiah and Isaiah, etc., for the people not listening to them. It's not their fault. It's almost certainly the people's fault. But leadership is still important. They still need to be getting their voices out there, because some people do listen. In case we haven't been admonished enough yet, Isaiah takes the Jewish people to task again for all manner of sins and iniquities. Yes, we are rebellious children. Yes, our hands are stained with crime. Yes, we will be devoured by the sword if we refuse to obey. In the middle of the foreboding is another Eicha. Again, it's relatively rare, but this Shabbat, this Saturday, we're going to be hit by it in 3 different ways. Eicha, she has become a harlot. The faithful city that was filled with justice, where righteousness dwelt, but now murderers. Let's play again with the word Eicha, this time through the lens of Isaiah, viewing the inevitable downward spiral of sinat chinam, meaning baseless hatred, hating someone for no real good reason, with what must have been a ruthless combination of fear, loathing, disdain, and hopelessness. O Jerusalem, a city of wickedness, deviance, defilement, deconstruction, and destruction. How did you stray so far from the course of righteousness? Alas, you will not listen to my message. In what way could I have effected real change in Teshuvah? What can be done to avert the fulfillment of this prophecy? Where are you, God, to make them listen to me, or to give me more powerful words? Where are you, citizens of Jerusalem, when I need you to change course? The word Eicha rings out like an alarm in the readings of this morning. Just like it will convoke us at Tisha B'Av, there is a despair, an existential cry for help, and an awareness of crisis that we can't help but read into the word. And the continuation of the article points out that all of these questions are very, very relevant today. And that's kind of the takeaway here, is Eicha is not simply a book that was written after the fact. Oh, how did this happen? Let's pick up the pieces. Echa is a question that we can and should be asking ourselves as we go through everything. And it's never too late to ask it. And even though I emphasize in many ways it was the people, it's also the leaders, because Moshe recognizes that in some ways his frustration, his limitations as a man who originally thought he could do it all, he said, I'm not perfect. How did I fail the people? How could I have been a better leader? He learns from his mistakes, though, and appoints judges with his father's advice and with God's permission. But again, this is a question we can ask ourselves constantly, and we need to. How are things going? How can we improve it? And if we don't do it, how can we go forward now? How can we ask for help? Echa is a question that, even though it's only 8 times in the Torah, it's a question that has infinite value, and hopefully we'll ask the first stages of Echa, the early questions, before we get to the last opportunity for it.